The police walked out of her apartment carrying $40,000 in cash and every ledger on her desk. They called it evidence. Stephanie St. Clair called it theft, then sat down and wrote the article that ended 8 careers. They came at 7:43 in the morning. Not midnight. Not the small hours when raids were designed to disorient, when darkness and exhaustion could be used as additional weapons against whoever answered the door. 7:43 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 1930, when Sugar Hill was already awake, when the fruit vendors were already on the corners of Edgecombe Avenue, when the women going to work as domestics in downtown Manhattan were already on the streetcars heading south, when the children were already on their way to school past the brownstones of 145th Street. They came in daylight. On purpose. 5 officers from the 32nd Precinct. 2 in uniform, 3 in plain clothes. The man in front, a detective named Hargrove, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried manner of someone who has never once in his professional life been made to justify his presence, held a document folded in thirds. He did not offer it for examination. He held it the way men hold things they want to be seen holding, as a statement of authority rather than an instrument of law. Stephanie St. Clair opened the door herself. She was dressed. This was the first thing Hargrove hadn't expected. A woman in a tailored gray dress, pearl earrings, her hair set with the meticulous care of someone who did not receive visitors in disarray, even visitors who arrived without invitation at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning. She looked at the 5 men on her threshold the way she looked at everything that required assessment. Completely, briefly, without expression. Mrs. St. Clair, Hargrove said, and the title was not respectful. It was the specific diminishment of a man using formality as condescension, the way certain white men in 1930s New York used politeness as a form of insult. "We have a warrant." He handed her the document. Stephanie read it. All of it. While Hargrove and his 4 men stood in her doorway and waited and shifted their weight with the impatience of men unaccustomed to being made to wait by black women reading documents, she read every line of the warrant with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that what was written on a page and what was legal were not always the same thing, and that the distance between them was precisely where she intended to operate. She stepped back from the door. They moved through her apartment with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. The desk in her office, mahogany, centered beneath the window that faced west over Edgecombe Avenue, was their first destination. From it they took the ledger. Then the correspondence files. Then the leather address book, dark at the corners from years of use, that contained the architecture of Stephanie's entire operation in her own precise handwriting. Then the strongbox. Hargrove spent 4 minutes on the strongbox. Stephanie watched him from the doorway of the office, her hands at her sides, her face composed into the particular stillness that was not passivity but calculation, the expression of a woman cataloging everything she was observing, filing it against future use. When his men produced a tool and forced the lock, she noted the tool, the technique, and the time. 10 minutes past 8. From the strongbox they removed the cash. $40,000. In bills, bound in rubber-banded stacks, each stack labeled in Stephanie's handwriting with a date and a source notation. The labeling was not incriminating. It was the opposite. It was the documentation of a woman who had understood, years before this morning, that her money would one day need to prove its own legitimacy, and who had prepared accordingly. Hargrove looked at the labeled stacks for a moment. Then he put them in the bag he'd brought and didn't look at them again. They were in the apartment for 22 minutes. When they left, Hargrove paused at the door. He did not look back at Stephanie. He addressed the middle distance in the way of a man delivering a message he has delivered many times before. "You'll be contacted about the proceedings," he said. The door closed. Stephanie stood in the center of her office for a long moment. The desk was bare. The shelves were partially cleared. The forced strongbox sat open on the floor, its lid at an angle empty. Through the window, Edgecombe Avenue continued its morning without interruption. The vendors, the streetcars, the children, the ordinary irreversible motion of a city that did not know and would not know what had just happened in this room. She did not call anyone. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and let the full dimensions of what had just occurred settle into their proper shape in her mind. Not the emotional shape, but the strategic one. What they had taken. What they had not found. What the warrant said. What the warrant did not say. What Hargrove had done in this room this morning, and what that meant about who had ordered it and why, and what they expected her to do next. They expected her to be finished. $40,000 was not a minor disruption. In October 1930, with the Depression tightening its grip on Harlem's economy with a force that white downtown barely registered, $40,000 represented months of operational capital, community support payments, legal retainer fees, and the financial foundation that kept her network functioning and her people paid. They had taken it because they believed it would stop her. Stephanie St. Clair walked to the bare mahogany desk, pulled out the chair, sat down, opened the single drawer they had somehow, in their certainty that they had found everything, overlooked. The shallow left drawer, the one that looked decorative, the one that held a clean writing pad and a fountain pen and nothing else. Because the strongbox was never where the most important things were kept. She uncapped the pen. She began to write. To understand what the 32nd Precinct had walked into that Tuesday morning, you have to understand what they had walked into it against. Not the money. Not the ledgers. Not the address book or the strongbox or the $40,000 in labeled, documented bills. Those were symptoms. The actual thing, the thing that Hargrove and his men had fundamentally failed to account for when they forced that lock and lifted that bag and walked back out into the October morning feeling like the job was done, was the woman who had built all of it, and the specific, particular 20-year architecture of intelligence and preparation that she had constructed around everything she owned. Start where she started. Martinique. The French Caribbean island sat in the Lesser Antilles like a green jewel that belonged entirely to the people who had not chosen to be there, the descendants of enslaved Africans who had built the island's sugar economy with their bodies and received in return the specific inheritance of French colonial society. The language, the Catholicism, the elaborate social hierarchy of color and class that arranged human beings in descending order of proximity to whiteness, and the daily, ambient message that the island's black population existed to serve a civilization that considered their existence incidental to its own. Stephanie absorbed this message the way all intelligent children absorb the messages their world sends them, completely and in reverse. She watched the French colonizers walk the roads of Martinique with the proprietary ease of men who had never been told that anything did not belong to them. She watched her mother work. She watched what deference cost and what it purchased. And she made, with the quiet resolution of a child who has already understood something that most adults spend their lives avoiding, a decision about which of those transactions she was willing to accept. She educated herself with the ferocity of someone for whom education was not a privilege but a weapon. French and English both, read and spoken with a precision that would later, in New York, consistently wrong-foot the men who expected her to speak neither with authority. History, mathematics, the specific grammar of legal documents, the language of the systems that control people's lives, which Stephanie understood you could not navigate without first learning to read fluently. She arrived in New York City in 1912. She was 26 years old. She carried $30 and a discipline of observation that 26 years of colonial Martinique had sharpened to a very fine point. Harlem in 1912 was in transition, a neighborhood that had been primarily white a decade earlier, now shifting rapidly as black families moved into the brownstones that white landlords, facing financial pressure, had begun renting across the color line. Stephanie arrived at the leading edge of what would become the Great Migration's most visible urban transformation, into a community still negotiating its own identity, still deciding what it was permitted to become. She found work in the only sector available to a black Caribbean woman without connections in 1912 New York: domestic service. She cleaned houses in neighborhoods where the women who owned those houses did not learn her last name. She did this work without complaint and without permanent intention, because Stephanie St. Clair had never once confused her circumstances with her destination. She observed. She listened. She learned the specific topography of power in New York, not the official topography of courts and precincts in City Hall, but the actual one underneath it, the web of obligation and leverage and mutual interest that determined what actually happened in this city regardless of what the official structure said should happen. And she found the numbers. The numbers racket was Harlem's economy operating below the economy. Players chose a 3-digit combination and placed bets as small as a penny against the chance of matching the day's winning figure, typically derived from published financial data, horse racing results, or Federal Reserve clearinghouse totals. The mathematics always favored the house. But in a depression approaching Harlem where white-owned banks denied accounts to black depositors, where white employers paid black workers wages that required daily arithmetic to survive on, where a penny bet returning $6 on a Wednesday morning could mean the difference between a family eating well or not, the numbers were not merely gambling. They were the shadow banking system of black America. Stephanie understood this with an economic clarity that her competitors, most of whom saw the numbers as a simple criminal enterprise, largely lacked. She entered the business in the early 1920s not as a runner or a collector but as an operator, from the beginning with the organizational intelligence of someone who had been studying how power structures sustain themselves for 20 years. She built her network methodically, recruiting runners who were known and trusted in their specific blocks, establishing counting stations that rotated on schedules she personally managed, creating a payout system so reliable and so transparent that her reputation for honest dealing became, within 3 years, the most valuable asset in her operation. By 1925, Stephanie's network covered the territory between 110th and 155th Streets, east of Amsterdam Avenue, over 40 runners, a dozen collection points, a counting operation that processed thousands of bets daily with the efficiency of a small bank. By the late 1920s, the operation was generating an estimated $200,000 per year. Every dollar documented. Every transaction recorded in the precise, unhurried handwriting that Hargrove had seen in the ledgers he'd carried out of her apartment and had not, in his confidence that he was dismantling something, stopped to fully understand. The documentation was not incidental. It was intentional. Stephanie had understood from the beginning of her operation that the numbers business existed in a legal gray territory that required, for its survival, either police protection or legal defensibility, and that police protection, which most of her competitors purchased through regular payments to precinct officers, was a form of dependency she refused. A woman who paid for protection was a woman who could have that protection withdrawn. A woman whose records were clean enough to survive legal scrutiny was a woman who owned her own security. She chose ownership. Every time. She also built what the ledgers could not contain. Her intelligence network inside the 32nd and 28th precincts had been assembled over 7 years by the time Hargrove knocked on her door, not through bribery which created obligation, but through the cultivation of relationships with people inside those institutions whose interests aligned with hers. Officers who resented corrupt colleagues, clerks who needed supplemental income and provided information that required no disloyalty to justify, community members who moved through official spaces and reported what they heard. Stephanie knew, usually within 24 hours, when a new raid was being planned, which officer had been assigned to the numbers detail, and which operators were currently paying for the protection that left her deliberately exposed. She knew the 32nd Precinct's relationship with at least 3 competing operators, men whose skin color and political connections made them preferable targets for police partnership. She had known for 8 months before October 1930 that pressure was building against her operation specifically. She had spent those 8 months preparing. The strongbox the officers had forced open contained the money and the visible records. The things she had allowed to be visible, the things she had calculated they would find and take and believe represented the full extent of what she had. The shallow left drawer of the mahogany desk, which Hargrove had not opened because it looked decorative and because men like Hargrove find what they are looking for and stop looking. That drawer contained the writing pad, the fountain pen, and the beginning of a letter that would, in the weeks ahead, prove considerably more dangerous than $40,000 in cash. Stephanie St. Clair had been preparing for this morning since before this morning had a date. The officers of the 32nd Precinct had taken her money. They had no idea what they had left behind. Corruption in 1930s New York was not an aberration. It was infrastructure. It did not hide in the shadows of the city's official systems. It was woven into them, structural and load-bearing, as essential to the daily functioning of certain precincts and certain courtrooms and certain city offices as the plumbing in the walls. It had its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own rules of conduct that were observed with a consistency that the official rules of law enforcement rarely matched. Men paid into it. Men profited from it. Men built careers inside it, rose through it, retired on it, and the machinery turned month after month and year after year, with the quiet, reliable rhythm of a system that had been running long enough that most of its participants had stopped thinking of it as corruption at all. They thought of it as the way things worked. The 32nd Precinct in 1930 covered a swath of Upper Harlem that included some of the densest concentration of numbers activity in the city. Within its boundaries operated dozens of numbers bankers, the operators who financed the bets, absorbed the losses and paid out the winners, ranging from small independent runners working single blocks to mid-level operators controlling networks of 15 or 20 collectors. The precinct's relationship with this economy was, by 1930, a settled arrangement that had been refined over years into something approaching a formal tariff system. Operators paid. The precinct looked elsewhere. The calculation was straightforward. The rates varied by operator size, by negotiated relationship, and by the specific officers involved. A sergeant named Dolan at the 32nd had, by 1930, been managing the precinct's numbers relationships for 3 years with the organizational efficiency of a man who understood that consistency was the foundation of a reliable revenue stream. Dolan knew which operators paid on time, which ones needed reminding, and which ones had political connections that made them more valuable as partners than as targets. He kept his own records, less meticulous than Stephanie's, but sufficient for his purposes. Stephanie was not on Dolan's partnership list. She had never been. From the earliest years of her operation, she had declined the arrangement that every other significant numbers operator in her territory accepted as the cost of doing business. She paid no protection fees to the 32nd Precinct or any other. She cultivated informants inside the department not to purchase tolerance but to maintain warning, early notice of raids that she used not to bribe her way out of them but to restructure her operations so that what the raids found was never enough to sustain a prosecution. This made her, in the specific logic of Dolan's economy, a problem. Not because she was breaking the law. Everyone in the numbers business was breaking the law. She was a problem because she was breaking the law without paying for the privilege, which in the precinct's operational framework was a form of theft. A woman extracting the benefit of the department's selective enforcement without contributing to the system that made that selectivity possible. There was also the matter of her influence. By 1929, 3 smaller operators in the 32nd Precinct's territory had quietly restructured their payment arrangements after conversations with Stephanie, not because she had told them to stop paying, but because her example demonstrated that it was possible not to. That there was a version of operating in Harlem's numbers economy that did not require monthly tribute to men with badges who had no legal right to collect it. This was, from Dolan's perspective, a contagion. A black Caribbean woman running a clean operation without paying protection was one thing. A black Caribbean woman whose example was beginning to suggest to other operators that they didn't have to pay either was something considerably more threatening to a system built on the universal acceptance of its own inevitability. The decision to move against Stephanie was not impulsive. It had been discussed within the precinct's informal leadership since early 1930. The question was not whether to act but how, and specifically how to do it in a way that would be definitive. A simple raid producing a prosecution was insufficient. Prosecutions required evidence, and evidence required conduct that Stephanie had been carefully ensuring was not visible. What was needed was something more direct. Something that removed resources rather than pursuing charges. Something that hit the financial foundation of her operation hard enough to force either a withdrawal or, more usefully, a recalculation. A recognition that operating without protection in the 32nd Precinct's territory was simply not survivable. The warrant for October 1930 was the result of that calculation. It was signed by a judge named Calloway whose relationship with the 32nd Precinct's leadership had been productive for both parties for 6 years. The probable cause cited in the warrant was thin enough that a careful reading, the kind of reading Stephanie had given it on her threshold on Tuesday morning, revealed it as the legal equivalent of a courtesy. The document existed to provide the action with the appearance of procedure. It was not designed to survive scrutiny. It was designed to enable a morning's work and produce a result that scrutiny would never be invited to assess. They had not anticipated scrutiny. What Dolan and Hargrove and the judge named Calloway had failed to fully account for, what the entire machinery of the 32nd Precinct's informal economy had failed to fully account for, was the 7 years of documentation that Stephanie St. Clair had been assembling about exactly how that machinery operated. She had informants inside the precinct. She had known about the discussions regarding her operation since February 1930, 8 months before Hargrove knocked on her door. She had known Dolan's name, his role, and the approximate structure of his payment arrangements since 1928. She had known about the judge named Calloway since 1929, when a contact at the courthouse had described, in specific and useful detail, the nature of his relationship with the 32nd Precinct's senior officers. She had not acted on any of this information prematurely. Stephanie St. Clair never acted on information prematurely. Information used too early warned the target and exhausted the advantage. Information held until the precise moment of maximum impact was something altogether different. It was a weapon with a specific purpose and a specific time. That time, as she sat at her bare mahogany desk on the morning of October 1930 with a fountain pen and a clean writing pad and 40,000 reasons to be precise, had arrived. She knew the machinery. She knew its operators. She knew its weaknesses, the points where the informal met the official, where the arrangement that everyone understood existed could be made visible to the people whose institutional interest required pretending it didn't. The officers of the 32nd Precinct had spent years building a system they believed was invisible. Stephanie St. Clair had spent years taking notes on it. Now she was going to write them up. She wrote the first draft in one sitting. October 7, 1930. 6 days after the seizure. The bare mahogany desk had been partially restocked by then. A new writing pad, a second fountain pen, a fresh pot of coffee that had gone cold at her elbow while she worked. The October light through the west-facing window of her Sugar Hill apartment moved from morning gold to afternoon gray while Stephanie wrote, and she did not look up from the page to watch it change. The first draft was 4 pages. Dense, specific, unsparing. It named Hargrove. It named Dolan. It named the judge named Calloway. It described the morning of October 1st in the precise sequential detail of a sworn affidavit. The time of arrival, the conduct at the door, the warrant's deficiencies, the items taken, the amounts, the labels on the cash bundles that documented their legitimate origin. It described the 32nd Precinct's payment arrangement with competing operators in terms specific enough that anyone reading it who knew anything about how Harlem's numbers economy functioned would understand immediately that this was not allegation. This was a ledger entry. A statement of account. She read it back when she finished. Then she set it aside and began the second draft. The second draft was better and more dangerous, because Stephanie had spent the 6 days between the seizure and this morning doing something more important than writing. She had been listening. Her network had been working. The contacts inside the 32nd Precinct, the clerk who passed her information about internal discussions, the junior officer who had never been comfortable with Dolan's arrangements and whose discomfort Stephanie had been carefully cultivating for 2 years, had both, in the days following the seizure, provided material that sharpened what she already knew into something considerably more actionable. Dates. Amounts. The names of 2 additional operators who had been paying Dolan's informal tariff and who, crucially, could be identified in the public record without being named directly, a technique of implication that Stephanie had studied in the legal documents she had read for 20 years and now deployed with the confidence of a practitioner. The second draft incorporated this new material with surgical precision. It was 3 pages. It was, if anything, quieter in tone than the first, less the voice of a woman who had been wronged, more the voice of a woman presenting evidence to a body with jurisdiction. It named specific dates of payment arrangements. It described the warrant's procedural deficiencies in language that quoted, without attribution, commentary from Gerald Foster that identified the exact statutory provisions the warrant had failed to satisfy. She read it back. Closer. Not finished. She made herself another pot of coffee, stood at the window for 10 minutes watching Edgecombe Avenue in the afternoon gray, and began the third draft. The third draft took 4 hours. It was 2.5 pages. It was the version that James Anderson at the Amsterdam News would read 3 days later, and it was the version that, when he finished reading it, would produce in him a silence of approximately 45 seconds before he said anything at all. What Stephanie had achieved in the third draft was a precision of construction that most trained lawyers would have found difficult to improve upon. Every allegation was specific and evidenced. Every name included was a name she could support with documentation that existed independently of her own account. Every description of the 32nd Precinct's conduct was written in language that was simultaneously accessible to a general Harlem readership and legally coherent enough to survive the scrutiny of the departmental review she intended it to trigger. She had also, in the third draft, made a decision that elevated the letter from a complaint to a public document of historical weight. She wrote it in the first person as Stephanie St. Clair, with her name and her address and her full identity attached, without qualification or concealment. In 1930 New York, a black Caribbean woman publicly accusing named white police officers of criminal conduct in a major newspaper was not merely bold. It was the kind of act that carried specific and serious personal risk, social, legal, and physical. Stephanie understood this. She had understood it before she wrote the first word of the first draft. She signed it anyway, because the signature was the point. An anonymous complaint could be dismissed, buried, attributed to sour grapes or criminal grievance. A signed public letter from a named woman with documented evidence and a specific address was something else entirely. It was an invitation to respond, and every possible response, Stephanie had calculated, produced an outcome she could use. On the morning of October 10, 1930, Stephanie St. Clair walked into the offices of the New York Amsterdam News on 7th Avenue and asked to speak with James Anderson. She was dressed in her charcoal wool coat, pearl earrings, her hat set correctly against the October cold. She carried a leather satchel. She waited in the reception area for 11 minutes without visible impatience, in the manner of a woman who has decided that the outcome of the next hour is already settled and that the waiting is merely procedural. Anderson was a careful man. He had been covering Harlem's relationship with its police force and its criminal economy for 6 years, and he had developed, over those years, a reporter's precise calibration of the difference between a story that was important and a story that was true, understanding that these were not always the same thing and that the most dangerous stories were the ones that were both. He had spoken with Stephanie twice before. Background conversations, information exchanged with the mutual discretion of people who understood each other's institutional constraints. He respected her. He was also, as any responsible editor must be, careful about what his paper put its name behind. He read the letter in full while Stephanie sat across from his desk. She watched him read. She did not watch his face, she watched his hands, the way they held the pages, the small movements that indicated where he slowed down, where he reread a line, where the weight of a specific sentence landed with the impact she had calculated it would land with. A woman who has spent 20 years reading rooms reads them in granular detail. Anderson finished. He set the pages on his desk. He was quiet for 45 seconds. The documentation, he said. How much of it can you provide independently of this letter? Stephanie opened the leather satchel. She placed on his desk, in 3 separate ordered stacks, the corroborating documentation she had assembled, the witness statements, the financial records demonstrating the legitimate sourcing of the seized funds, and a 4-page supplementary document, prepared by Gerald Foster, signed and notarized, that laid out the warrant's procedural deficiencies in formal legal language. Anderson looked at the 3 stacks for a long moment. 2 words, he said. We publish. But publishing was not, by itself, the full extent of the strategy. It was the visible element, the one that would be seen, discussed, reproduced on stoops and in barbershops and in the pews of Abyssinian Baptist Church. The press was the surface of what Stephanie had built. Underneath it, 2 additional tracks were moving simultaneously toward the same destination. Gerald Foster had filed, on October 9, 1 day before Stephanie's meeting with Anderson, a formal legal challenge to the warrant's validity with the Manhattan Civil Court. The challenge was narrow, technical, and precisely targeted. It identified 3 specific procedural deficiencies in the warrant's construction and requested, on those grounds, the return of all seized property pending a full hearing. It did not make broad allegations. It did not accuse anyone of corruption. It was a clean legal document doing a clean legal thing, which was exactly why it was dangerous, because a broad allegation could be met with a broad denial, but a specific procedural challenge required a specific procedural response, and the process of producing that response would require the 32nd Precinct to produce, in an official legal forum, documentation of the warrant's origins. Documentation they did not want produced. The 3rd track moved more quietly still. Stephanie had spent the days following the seizure in a series of conversations, some in person, some by telephone, with 4 other Harlem business owners and numbers operators who had been subjected to the 32nd Precinct's protection arrangements and who had, over the years, harbored their own accumulation of grievance about the terms of that arrangement. She had not asked them to come forward publicly. She had asked them to provide sworn statements, private documents held by Foster, that would be available if and when the legal proceedings required additional corroborative testimony. 3 of the 4 said yes. The 4th said he needed to think about it. Stephanie gave him 2 days. He said yes on the 2nd day. She had known he would. People in positions of suppressed grievance almost always say yes when someone else has already said it first and louder. What they needed was not permission but precedent, the knowledge that the first person to speak had not immediately been destroyed. Stephanie's public letter in the Amsterdam News would be that precedent. Her signed name at the bottom of a document accusing named officers in a major newspaper was not merely a personal act of defiance. It was a signal to everyone in Harlem who had been waiting to see if it was survivable to stand up. She was about to show them. The Amsterdam News published Stephanie St. Clair's letter on October 14, 1930. It ran on page 3, under a headline that Anderson had written himself, in the measured but precise language of a paper that understood exactly what it was doing and had decided, with full institutional awareness of the consequences, to do it anyway. Harlem read it over breakfast, on streetcars, in barbershops before the first customer of the morning sat down, in the back rooms of churches before Tuesday Bible study, in the offices of lawyers and the apartments of ministers and the kitchens of women who had been paying attention to Stephanie St. Clair for years and who read her words and recognized in them the specific grammar of a woman who had not written out of anger. She had written out of preparation. The machinery of the 32nd Precinct had been running for years in the confidence of invisibility. October 14, 1930, was the morning it became visible. October 14, 1930 arrived cold and clear. A Tuesday. The kind of sharp autumn morning that made the brownstones of Sugar Hill look carved from slate, that sent the breath of the fruit vendors on Edgecombe Avenue up in small white clouds, that carried the smell of coal smoke and October air through the open transom windows of the apartments above 135th Street, where Harlem was already awake and moving before the sun had fully committed to the day. The Amsterdam news arrived at the corner newsstands at 6:45 in the morning. By 7:15, every copy on Lenox Avenue had been sold. The letter ran on page 3. 2 columns set in the Amsterdam News's standard typeface, under a headline that read, "Harlem Numbers Operator Charges 32nd Precinct Officers with Unlawful Seizure." Anderson had written the headline with the care of a man who understood the difference between a headline that inflamed and a headline that informed, and who had made, in choosing the latter, a deliberate editorial statement that the story was serious enough not to require embellishment. The letter itself was exactly what Stephanie had written. Not abbreviated. Not softened. Anderson had made 2 minor edits for legal clarity, both of which Stephanie had reviewed and approved before publication. The rest was her words, her evidence, her name, her address. 2.5 pages rendered in newspaper columns on page 3 of the New York Amsterdam News, October 14, 1930. Harlem read it the way communities read things that named their own experience out loud for the first time, with the specific combination of recognition and relief that comes when something everyone has known privately becomes something someone has said publicly. The 32nd Precinct's arrangements were not a secret in Harlem. They were an open secret, the kind of thing that existed in the understood knowledge of a community without existing in any official record, protected by the shared, exhausted calculation that speaking about it publicly accomplished nothing except making the speaker a target. Stephanie St. Clair had just spoken about it publicly, with her name on it, with documentation attached, in the most widely read black newspaper in New York City. The calculation had changed. By 8 o'clock that morning, Gerald Foster's office telephone had rung 4 times. 2 of the callers were journalists, one from the Amsterdam News following up on the legal filing Anderson had referenced in his editorial note accompanying the letter, one from a smaller Harlem weekly whose editor had read page 3 over his breakfast and understood immediately that a larger story was developing. One caller was a minister from a congregation on 136th Street whose members included 2 families directly affected by the 32nd Precinct's practices and who wanted to understand what, if anything, they could do. The 4th caller did not leave a name. Foster noted all 4 calls in his ledger. He returned them in order of strategic priority. At Stephanie's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the morning was quiet. She had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of someone who has set a mechanism in motion and is now listening for the first sounds of its engagement. She sat at the mahogany desk, a fresh ledger open in front of her, and recorded the morning's developments as they reached her through the network of contacts that had, since the letter's publication, begun reporting with increased frequency and detail. At 8:47 she received word through her precinct contact that Dolan had arrived at the 32nd that morning 40 minutes earlier than usual. She wrote that down. The time. The deviation from his normal schedule. The implication. A man who arrives early is a man who has something to manage. The departmental response came in stages, each one more revealing than the last. The first stage arrived by midday on October 14th. An official statement from the 32nd Precinct's commanding officer, a captain named Whitfield, released to the press through the department's standard channels. The statement was 4 sentences. It described the October 1st warrant as lawfully obtained and lawfully executed, characterized Stephanie's letter as the complaint of a known criminal operator seeking to evade legitimate law enforcement activity, and declined to comment further on an ongoing legal matter. It was, as official statements go, competent. It said nothing actionable. It provided no detail that could be used against the department. It also, crucially, confirmed every factual element of Stephanie's account without intending to. The warrant was real. The seizure had occurred. The department was not disputing the facts. It was disputing their characterization. And in a legal proceeding, the difference between undisputed facts and disputed characterization was precisely the territory where Gerald Foster had been building his case for 2 weeks. Stephanie read Whitfield's statement when Foster sent it to her by messenger at 2 in the afternoon. She read it twice. Then she wrote one line in her ledger. They have confirmed the account. Proceed. The second stage arrived 3 days later. On October 17th, a junior officer from the 32nd Precinct, a man named Carroll who had been on the force for 2 years and who had not been among the 5 officers present at Stephanie's apartment on October 1st, presented himself at Gerald Foster's office on 135th Street without prior contact or appointment. He sat in Foster's waiting room for 20 minutes. When Foster came out, Carroll said that he had information relevant to the civil proceeding and that he was prepared to provide a statement. Foster showed him in. He took the statement himself in longhand, over the course of 90 minutes. Carroll's statement did not address the October 1st seizure directly. What it addressed was the broader operational context, the precinct's payment arrangements, Dolan's role in managing them, the specific operators whose protection fees Carroll had personally observed being collected and recorded. It was not, by the standards of formal legal testimony, a complete account. But it was corroborative, specific, and signed. Foster called Stephanie that evening. "We have an inside witness," he said. Stephanie was quiet for a moment. "How reliable?" "Frightened," Foster said. "But consistent." He said the same things 3 different ways and the details matched each time. "Keep him close," Stephanie said. "And keep him calm. A frightened witness who stays consistent is better than a confident one who embellishes." Foster made a note. This was the kind of instruction that reminded him, at regular intervals across their professional relationship, that Stephanie St. Clair understood the architecture of legal proceedings with a sophistication that most of his formally trained colleagues would have found startling. The civil hearing was scheduled for November 18, 1930, 35 days after the seizure. In the weeks between the Amsterdam news publication and the hearing date, the pressure on the 32nd Precinct's informal economy operated with the quiet, compounding force of a structural crack in a load-bearing wall. 3 operators who had been paying Dolan's arrangements quietly stopped paying. Not publicly, not with announcement, they simply ceased. The calculation that had made the payments rational, that refusal meant exposure, that exposure meant raids, that raids meant losses that exceeded the protection fee, had been altered by Stephanie's letter in a way that no official response could fully reverse. Because the letter had demonstrated that exposure was not exclusively a weapon in the department's hands. It was also, in the right hands with the right documentation, a weapon that pointed the other way. Dolan knew this. Hargrove knew it. Captain Whitfield, who had issued 4 sentences of careful official language and watched it change nothing, knew it. On November 3, 1930, 18 days after publication, 15 days before the civil hearing, Officer Dolan filed for departmental medical leave. He did not return to active duty at the 32nd Precinct. Stephanie received word of this through her precinct contact on the morning of November 4th. She was seated at the mahogany desk when the information arrived. She picked up her fountain pen, opened her ledger to the current page, made a notation, Dolan. Medical leave filed. November 3rd. Then she turned to a clean page and began preparing her documentation for the November 18th hearing. She did not smile. She did not speak to anyone about what the notation meant. She did not need to. The machinery of the 32nd Precinct had been running for years on the assumption that it was too large, too established, too protected by its own institutional weight to be moved by any single person's account of its conduct. Stephanie St. Clair had published 2.5 pages in a newspaper. The machinery was moving. The civil hearing on November 18, 1930 lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. It was held in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Manhattan Civil Courthouse on Center Street, a room of dark wood paneling and tall windows that admitted the pale November light in long, thin rectangles across the floor. Gerald Foster represented Stephanie at the petitioner's table. The department sent 2 attorneys and Captain Whitfield, who sat in the gallery in his dress uniform with the careful composure of a man who has been told by people he trusts that the morning will be manageable. It was not manageable. Foster's legal challenge to the warrant's validity had been constructed, over 6 weeks, with the specific intention of forcing the department to produce documentation it did not want produced. The 3 procedural deficiencies he had identified required, under the relevant statutory provisions, that the department demonstrate, in open court on the record, the evidentiary basis on which probable cause had been established for the October 1st seizure. This was documentation that existed only in the forms signed by the judge named Calloway, and those forms, when Foster submitted them for examination, revealed exactly the thinness that Stephanie had identified on her threshold the morning Hargrove handed them to her. The presiding judge, a man named Reeves who had no established relationship with the 32nd Precinct and who approached the morning's proceedings with the professional neutrality of someone who had not been consulted in advance about the outcome, read the warrant documentation with the same deliberate attention that Stephanie had given it 6 weeks earlier. He asked 3 questions. The department's attorneys answered 2 of them satisfactorily. The third, regarding the specific documented basis for the probable cause finding, they could not answer in terms the court found sufficient. Judge Reeves ordered the return of all seized funds pending a full evidentiary review. The $40,000, documented, labeled, accounted for in Stephanie's precise handwriting, was returned to her custody within 14 days. The consequences for the 32nd Precinct's leadership unfolded across the following months with the measured inevitability of a tide. Officer Carroll's statement, combined with the 3 sworn affidavits from the operators Stephanie had organized, provided the Departmental Trials Division with sufficient documented basis to open a formal internal investigation into Dolan's arrangements. The investigation was not aggressive. Internal investigations of police corruption in 1930s New York rarely were, but it was a proceeding on the record, with named subjects and documented allegations, and its existence alone was sufficient to permanently alter the operational calculus of the 32nd Precinct's informal economy. Dolan did not return from medical leave. His arrangements, without his management, did not survive the scrutiny that the investigation's existence had created. The operators who had been paying quietly stopped. The officers who had been collecting quietly stopped collecting. The machinery did not collapse dramatically. It simply, gradually, ceased to function. The way corrupt systems cease to function when the assumption of invisibility is removed and the participants discover that the transaction costs of continuation now exceed the benefits. Hargrove was transferred to a precinct in Lower Manhattan in February 1931. The judge named Calloway signed no further warrants for operations in the 32nd Precinct's territory for the remainder of that year. The precinct did not raid Stephanie St. Clair's operation again. Harlem understood what had happened, even without the details that would take years to fully surface. The community always understands the shape of a thing before it understands its specifics. What the neighborhood knew by the winter of 1930 was that Stephanie St. Clair had been hit hard by people with institutional power and the full backing of the system that was supposed to make hitting her illegal, and that she had not been finished. She had published a letter. She had gone to court. She had gotten her money back. In a Harlem where the Depression was tightening its grip on every block, where families were losing apartments and jobs and the thin margins that separated survival from destitution, where the official systems of law and commerce had demonstrated their indifference to black lives with a consistency that required no argument. In that Harlem, what Stephanie had done was not merely a legal victory. It was a proof of concept. A demonstration, in the most practical and visible terms available, that the machinery of institutional power was not invulnerable. That it had weaknesses. That those weaknesses could be found, documented, and used. That a black Caribbean woman with a fountain pen and a newspaper contact and the patience to build a case over months could walk into a courtroom on Center Street and walk out with her money. This was, in 1930, a remarkable thing. It remains, nearly a century later, a remarkable thing. Stephanie St. Clair continued operating her numbers business through the 1930s and into the 1940s. She continued placing public notices in the Amsterdam News, letters that named corrupt officers, documented specific incidents, and maintained, through the consistent public exercise of her voice, a form of accountability over the precincts that covered her territory that no official oversight body was providing. She was arrested multiple times across those decades. She was convicted rarely. Her legal defense was always meticulous, always prepared, always rooted in documentation she had assembled long before the arrest occurred. She fought Dutch Schultz's takeover attempt in 1931 and won. She mentored Bumpy Johnson through the years when he was learning what she had already mastered. The understanding that information outlasts intimidation, that patience outlasts aggression, that the woman who keeps the clearest records in the room is the woman who controls the room's future. She navigated the competing pressures of the Italian organized crime structure, the corrupt police apparatus, the Depression economy, and the double weight of racial and gender discrimination in one of the most complex urban environments in American history. She did all of it without ever becoming anything other than exactly who she had decided to be on the day she arrived in New York City with $30 and the accumulated observation of a Martinique childhood spent watching what power looked like and deciding she would have it on her own terms. She died on December 11, 1969. She was 83 years old. She died in New York City, the city that had spent 57 years trying to contain her and had never once succeeded. History has a habit of recording the names of the men who surrounded remarkable women while leaving the women themselves in the margins. Stephanie St. Clair has appeared in footnotes and supporting roles in accounts of Dutch Schultz's empire, Bumpy Johnson's rise, and the Harlem underworld's larger story. The films, the documentaries, the books about this era have found room consistently for the men in her orbit and room only occasionally, briefly, and insufficiently for the woman at the center. This is the cost of a history written by people who decided, consciously or not, which stories deserve to be the main story. What Stephanie St. Clair did in October and November of 1930, What she did with a fountain pen and 3 drafts and a leather satchel full of documentation and the willingness to sign her name to something that most people in her position would have been too frightened or too exhausted to write, was not simply a legal maneuver. It was one of the earliest documented instances of a black woman in New York City using the press as a formal instrument of accountability against police corruption. Decades before the civil rights movement developed the strategic media toolkit that would help dismantle legal segregation, Stephanie St. Clair was already operating inside that logic. She had understood, in 1930, what the movement would spend years learning to articulate. That visibility is a weapon, that the record matters, that the woman who controls the narrative controls the outcome. She controlled the outcome. She always did. And the record, her record, the one she built and maintained and signed her name to through 5 decades of operating in a city that tried repeatedly to take everything she had, that record is still here. Still speaking. In her own precise, unhurried hand.